Hello and welcome to Inside Intelligence, brought to you by the Intelligence Analysis Program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a guest panel providing an initial assessment of the Russian attack on Ukraine. My name is Peter Huggins, and I'm the event producer. Please note today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to our moderator, Dr. Michael J. Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everyone to our program today. We have a distinguished panel of Johns Hopkins AAP faculty to give their assessment on the war in Ukraine. And we'll focus today on the following areas: the political military situation, the intelligence and cybersecurity situation, the impact on the environment in the war zone and beyond, and the war's impact on energy and international markets. Now, let me introduce our guests. Donald Jensen is editor-in-chief and a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, where he oversees research and analysis. Don Jensen writes extensively on Russian domestic politics and that country's foreign and security policies, especially the Kremlin's waging of information warfare and its conduct of influence operations abroad. He also specializes in the domestic and foreign policies of other post-Soviet states, especially Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic republics. He will join us later in the call. Craig Hart is a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University's Energy Policy and Climate program. Craig serves as executive director of the Pace Energy and Climate Center at Pace University and is non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and Global Energy Center. Craig also has advised Uzbekistan and the Republic of Georgia on energy and utility reform. Elizabeth Hesame is a faculty lecturer of international environmental law and policy at Johns Hopkins University AAP and a noted expert on environmental issues and armed conflict in Afghanistan. She was a founding member of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, for which she is currently producing content on hydrodiplomacy and hydrogovernance. She was recently nominated to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And Ron Marks is a 38-year veteran of the U.S. national security community. In his lengthy CIA career, Ron was a clandestine service officer, special assistant to the ADCI for military affairs, and a Senate liaison for 5 DCIs. He also served on Capitol Hill as intelligence counsel to Senate Majority Leaders Bob Dole and Trent Lott. Now, my co-host today is Stephen Grenier, the program director of Global Security Studies at Johns Hopkins Advanced Academic Programs. He previously served as the associate director for cadet leadership programs at the Citadel and as the director for Canadian Affairs in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense Policy. As a career active duty U.S. Army Special Forces officer, he worked in 32 countries and completed 11 combat tours. Our audience welcome, and we welcome your questions too. Please put your questions in the chat and we will get to them in the second half of our program. Now let's get started. Steve, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Ard. So despite an unprecedented amount of media and participant observer coverage, we really know very little what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. We have snapshots, but we don't have a lot of confirmed information about the losses that both sides have suffered or an accurate picture of ongoing military operations. We obviously don't know how the war in Ukraine will end or what will be the near, mid, or even long-term consequences. But what we can offer today is a collection of experts, who can provide their analyses on some of the stunning developments that have happened over the last several days. And so I want to turn it over first to Professor Marks. The intelligence community's assessments in the weeks leading up to the Russian invasion appear to have been extremely accurate, and that has led to a really a series of strong foreign policy decisions and developments, at least in the Western world. What are some of the developments that might have surprised you during your week? And just love to get your initial observations on the conflict.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming, and I thank you all for having me here. It's funny. I started off my career as a Soviet European officer in CIA, and back in the ancient days of yore, back in the 80s, and watching all of this recently has given me certainly some memories and a reminder of that some things don't change over time, even when you change the name of the country. The intelligence community has been very good throughout this, and I think this is a good example of what happens when you have people in place who know the material, who cooperate with each other and know what's going on. You've got Avril Haines over at the Director of National Intelligence, Bill Burns at CIA, having someone who has that kind of diplomatic background and can understand the uses and needs of the policymaker. And also, frankly, with Jake Sullivan, I realize this is all sounding like a great praise for them, but they've done a very good job. Sullivan and President, and by the way, President Biden, when I first knew him again in the ancient days of yore, was on the Senate Intelligence Committee for years and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So he knows the value of this information. We've had people who were able to get it out quickly. They are also willing to share it and get it around to different organizations, not only EU, but also our other more non-traditional partners, to let them know what's going on. So that information in an area of the world that frankly hadn't been paid much attention to for a while, but has been ramping up in the last few years. Good coverage and a willingness to share by people who know what they're talking about and know what we need to do.
So that's excellent insight. What are some of the developments that have most surprised you over the last week?
Well, it's always early days, and one of the things that I learned fairly quickly is a long time ago in this game was, don't make your judgments in the first couple of days. Where if you compare this to a boxing match, we're in round 1 of 12, or maybe round 2. I was surprised, however, I think if I had to say it, by Putin's underestimation of what the reaction was going to be to his actions. And I will talk a little bit about it when we get into the cyber section of this, but he really came off like a 1980s KGB guy. I don't really care what's going on. And we got this message we're going to put out. And as long as everybody at home is happy, I don't care. And I'm going to be a little flip about that, but you really can tell that his mindset doesn't really take into account all of this hybrid warfare that he's been going on about. The Gerasimov doctrine, which may or may not exist, but poor Gerasimov was certainly at the table. This idea that political and economics are a part of military action, that cyber is a huge portion of this, because cyber is about a couple of things, but one of which is it's about information and the control of that information. And he hasn't had that from day one. And they've just been caught flat-footed on the international stage. That has really surprised me. I thought they would be better than that, and boy, they clearly are not.
That is, I think, one of the surprising. We had this Russian information operations juggernaut that doesn't seem to have been able to materialize and influence the broader range. What's your initial assessment of Ukraine? How has this country, which I think a lot of people didn't give them much of a chance, especially on the information side, how are they faring? And what can they? You think that they can continue to do well, and what are some of the things they need to improve on?
Well, they certainly, again, caught everybody by surprise, and I think part of it, it goes to some of the leadership there. There's always been laughter in this country. The president was an actor, and for all of us who remember Ronald Reagan, we used to laugh about that. But actors are funny things. They, by virtue of what they have to do for a living, they know the value of words. They know the value of actions. Watching him in particular toss out these rather pithy phrases, He dresses younger. He looks younger. You know, I was joking with someone the other day. It looks like a millennial versus an aging baby boomer, and that's really what it is. He's deliberately kept his people around him, and he dresses young. He looks young. He puts forward a youthful view. He really has appealed to younger people through the various media of cyberspace. I'm a follower of, listen, I teach this stuff. I have to know it. So I'm sitting on TikTok and on Gram and on Twitter and on these other media. And I will tell you something right now that Ukraine dominates on that. Their message is clear. They're able to really reach out to the 20 and 30-year-olds and say, look, this is what's going on. We're vis-a-vis the Russian stuff, which is very, very ham-handed, you know, like nuclear wars, and you got a draft notice was the one I saw the other day, and that kind of thing. So that has been surprising from the Ukraine part. The sustainability of that, I don't know. I don't know what their depth is at this point. And also, frankly, I might also say that, you know, we're early in the game in terms of dealing with the command and control issues. I'll slip maybe into my presentation a little bit now and just say to you that, you know, one of the issues of cyberspace, yes, it touches, you know, 5.8 billion people. I, you know, give you the numbers until I'm blue. It's a quarter of the world's economy, blah, blah, blah. But what it really composed of, and good friend of mine, Michael Hayden, and we worked together over the years, and Michael always talks about water and pipes. You know, the pipes of cyberspace are the hardware and the software. So when you start to see cyber attacks on, wiperware that wipes out the stuff on the computers, or DDoSes or denial of services, that's on the computer. But the water is the information. And that ability to control that information, direct that information, control the essentially the dialogue, that's a real force multiplier these days. And again, we were talking earlier about what Putin didn't understand. And I think that really is that you can, within a week, get a Germany or get a Finland and Sweden to start changing their minds about something that they haven't thought about for 20 or 30 years. That power is great. Ukraine has got it right now. And I don't know whether Russia can compete to get it back, but I will say that if the Russians wish to, and you can start to see it today, they've hit the comms towers in Kyiv. They'll go after the communications now. That's why as maybe it's a little silly sometimes when you hear, or it sounds silly when Elon Musk is sending in these internet towers, really? Well, that's a good reason for that. That will allow them to continue their messaging. That soft power of theirs in Ukraine is their weapon right now. It's going to take a while to get the Stingers there. It's taking a while to get Javelins there. It'll take a while to get those leftover MiGs from Poland and Romania and Slovakia there. But that soft power right now is really saving them. And I think that's what you're going to see them continue to push forward. But again, if the Russians start to squeeze on the command control side and really engage in true information warfare and cut off their capabilities and begin to cut off their actual functioning, working parts of the government going after the hardware, we've yet to see them roll that out. The Russians on the hard side, the pipe side, have not yet rolled out their capabilities.
Well, those are your point about the influence of the information or the information campaign to the political world. I think one of the things we saw at the beginning of the conflict was the impact of environmental issues when the Russian forces entered the containment zone of Chernobyl and struck a gas pipeline. So these environmental issues are often relegated to off to the side, but they've been really in the forefront during this conflict so far. So turning to Professor Hassami, what are some of your initial assessments for the impact of environmental issues on this conflict?
Okay, I think it's extremely concerning. I have a PowerPoint. I don't know if they want to go ahead and put that up yet, or
I think Dr. Ard is going to try to pull that up.
Okay, yeah. Just to give you an example, I have some really concerning photos that have been published. Of course, this is still very early days. We don't know. We don't know everything yet, but it's very concerning. Okay, here we go. Perfect. Okay, so I want to start just with petroleum storage facilities that have been bombed, because that's something that we know for sure is going to cause tremendous pollution. So this is a picture, it was from Al Jazeera, published by Al Jazeera, a Russian missile attack near Kyiv. And so obviously this has happened several places. So I'll go to the next slide. And yeah, so I just want to say before I get started that, of course, this is the very initial stages of kind of determining what the environmental damage is. But if this is something you're interested in, I really highly recommend the Conflict and Environment Observatory, CEOBS.org. They have the latest information, but there are already signs of potential acute and long-term damage to health and human and environmental health. There have been damage to Ukrainian military and civilian structures, airfields, naval facilities, fuel storage, as we saw just before, power stations, and oil storage is really concerning, because that we've seen before. You know, we saw that in the first Gulf War. We saw that with ISIS destroying oil facilities. And so we know what the damage could potentially look like, and it's terrifying. Also, ammunition storage facilities are being targeted, and those are often smaller and near civilian areas. So that's very concerning. One thing that really concerns me is the grain silos that are being damaged. That could impact food security internationally, and that's concerning, especially to very vulnerable states like Yemen that are depending on those stores. And we know that the Russians hit a chemical tanker near Odessa port in the Black Sea. So again, human, environmental, and food security is at risk right now. And then next slide. And of course, because of these things, we're going to have air and water pollution. I think this is pretty clear. Air pollution, we already see the smoke plumes already. We can expect toxic gas, particulate matter, heavy metal contamination of soil and water. Also, when you have massive fires, the firefighting can often leave very toxic residue. And I would say coastal pollution from the naval facilities that are being targeted can be an issue as well.
No, thank you. That's go ahead.
Yeah, I have a few more. Sorry, that's an arms depot. And I'll go to the next slide. Oh, okay. So I wanted to just mention a little bit about Chernobyl, because when this first started, I had a lot of questions from people. Well, why are they targeting Chernobyl? And it's, for anybody, you know, of my age who remember the meltdown, that's a terrifying thought. If Chernobyl was targeted, but that's not necessarily the real danger there. First of all, why did they capture Chernobyl? Well, first of all, the area around Chernobyl is very marshy. And so if you're driving tanks through that region, those are the only good roads you can really get through. So that was one of the reasons that Chernobyl was taken. Of course, there were early reports that the Russian forces had held Chernobyl workers hostage, and I haven't heard anything to dispute that since that happened. Next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about a few issues with Chernobyl. So we have seen elevated gamma radiation in the exclusion zone. That could be due to heavy vehicle movement around the facility, which kicks up dust. And so I just wanted to mention to the audience who may not be that familiar with Chernobyl, especially younger members of the audience, the reactor is not functioning, but its storage facility contains significant radioactive waste. And so Edward Lyman stated that he's most worried about the disruption of electrical power to the site, where cooling pumps are used to keep conditions calm inside the spent fuel storage tanks. So any disruption to power to Chernobyl could be catastrophic. I mean, the risk of an accidental shooting or missile strike is very concerning as well. It could release cesium-137 and strontium-90, but someone actually targeting the facility is always a concern, but it's not as much as just an accidental situation when there's armed conflict occurring around it. Next slide. So I just wanted to talk about one of the other major issues in terms of environmental damage is that Ukraine has many industrial facilities that could be possibly targeted or damaged accidentally. Water quality and security is already precarious in Ukraine. It's heavily industrialized, so there's already issues with old or abandoned mines and chemical plants. On February 24th, residents of Odessa were warned that the Odessa port plant might be targeted, and the Odessa plant produces ammonia and other chemicals. So there's very serious concerns with that. And also discharge from the Yuncom mine, a site of nuclear tests in the 1970s. Also, landmines are a real concern. They're being laid on beaches and border areas, and landmines are always devastating because they continue a war, even once this conflict is over. Once landmines are laid, and there's usually never very good recording of where they've been laid, and then it continues a war for decades after. Next slide. So conclusions, just the situation is really volatile. It's developing. We don't know a lot right now. Eastern Ukraine is full of industrial sites, metallurgical plants, chemical factories, power stations, and rundown mines. That's from Richard Peerhouse. An active armed conflict near those sensitive industrial and nuclear sites will almost certainly create toxic pollution, harming populations near the sites, the environment, livestock, and wildlife, which makes a humanitarian crisis that much worse. So those are just a few of my thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. So energy issues, of course, are front and center in this conflict as well. We've heard a lot about the destabilization of energy markets, rising energy prices, and everyone now feels like they're an expert, or at least have some knowledge about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and its future. So turning to Professor Hart, what are some of your initial observations? What are some of the things that might keep you up at night as we proceed into the second week of this conflict?
Sure. So I think there's going to be some immediate, obviously, price increases, but the issues that I think are more concerning are really more in the medium and the long term. To some extent, the energy issues that are going to unfold or unfolding as a result of this invasion really have to be understood back decades in the context of the Soviet Union and its collapse. But I'll get into that very briefly, touching on it because given the limits of time. But I think the first thing to understand is that from at least the Russian perspective and the Ukrainian perspective, both countries are highly dependent or highly exposed to oil and gas pricing. But in Russia's case, 30% of their GDP in any year, 30% or more, will be from oil and gas, and even higher percentages of the state budget and foreign currency, hard currency. So Russia is extremely dependent on these oil and gas sales. And the invasion, in some ways, I mean, it's obviously a misstep and a miscalculation, because in doing this, they've upset their most important customer, which is Europe, and in particular, Germany. And if there was any question that had been debated for over the past decade or so over whether or not Germany and Europe had become too dependent upon Russia as a supplier, I think this invasion now settles that question. At least it settles it for the immediate term and well into the future. But there is a Russian side to this, and I do think it's important to have an understanding of that if you really want to understand perhaps what's going through Vladimir Putin's mind. Back at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, there had been, they not only lost their country, but they also lost their pipeline and their electricity network. That was fragmented, splintered. And all of this was going to require reworking some relationships, not only within the former Soviet bloc, but also vis-a-vis Europe, who they had since the 60s had relationships built on gas that actually were stabilizing at that time, because it was a common economic interest that they shared in selling gas to Europe, which helped European growth. And in exchange, of course, that provided vital revenues for the Soviet Union. But over time, the EU has been moving to liberalize and and really debundle its markets for electricity and gas. And in the process, it's been changing the regulatory structure that governs these relationships with Soviet Union and now Russia. And in the process of doing this, this has not only unsettled some individual fortunes, but it's also impacting the potential fortunes of the Russian state. And Ukraine has been going along with that liberalization, even though Ukraine is outside of the EU, and that's been, a very sensitive topic. Ukraine is a member of the European Energy Community, an EU-sponsored organization that the purpose of which is to get these former Eastern European countries, the Eastern Bloc, to adopt, that are not part of the EU yet, to get them to adopt EU energy regulation. And as a matter of fact, at the time the Russians had invaded, Ukraine was actually islanding its electricity grid as a planned test with integration into the European Union's ENTSO-E electricity grid. So, whether that is the timing of the invasion is pure coincidence or intentional in relation to this, that I do not know. But I think that's significant. Now, Russia knows that given liberalization and destabilization of these energy relationships, that it was going to have some challenges. And it also knows that with the environmental agenda in Europe, particularly climate and decarbonization, that it would over time start to lose market share. But this invasion now means that Russia has accelerated the loss of that market share. And this is going to have some medium-term impacts upon Russian state revenues. And in the longer term, as Europe moves now to very aggressively, more aggressively adopt renewables, something that's already on the plan, but also maybe Germany is going to revisit this issue of closing its nuclear plants and taking a second look at coal firepower that's currently operating, as well as building LNG. In other words, there's going to be a dramatic change to the energy mix in Europe that is going to now subordinate cost to security. And that's going to mean, as well as the environment, and those two now will work together. But this means ultimately where Russia is going is that they're accelerating the loss to their most important client. And in the best case scenario that I can see, Russia is now going to be forced to do more business with China. And that's going to mean that Russia is basically consigning itself as a satellite state economically to Russia, which if you look at just look at the population numbers and the growth rates, China's got 1 billion extra people and change to Russia. So this is a colossal misstep on Vladimir Putin's part.
Well, thank you for that insight. And as right before we started, I saw press reports of, and I haven't been able to confirm them, of course, but of Pakistan stepping forward to buy a large amount of not only wheat, but of oil as well, and gas. So this seems to be playing out as we speak. So we're going to turn last to Professor Don Jensen, who's going to talk about some of the political and military developments. I don't think any of us would have thought 5 days ago we would have seen such dramatic changes in European political and military. I mean, who would have thought that Germany, Finland, Sweden, the list goes on, would be supplying arms to Ukraine, and Switzerland would be potentially enforcing sanctions. So anyway, I will turn it over to Dr. Jensen to provide his initial observations of the war in Ukraine.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for everybody being here today, and I apologize for my technical difficulties. I've got 2 minutes to talk about the state of play on the ground, and I may go to about 2.5 minutes, so bear with me. First of all, I wanted to say that, remember, this is This is Vladimir Putin's reformed Russian military. This is Chief of Staff Gerasimov's reformed Russian military. So everybody looked at this, despite all the uncertainties and questions that come up every day, including this afternoon. Everybody has looked at this as an opportunity for the Russian army to roll over the Ukrainians. And it hasn't happened. And the question why it hasn't happened, I think, is going to be a subject of fierce debate for years to come. But first, let's get to Russian goals, and then I'll talk about how the campaigns are going so far, and then talk about what an endgame might be. I should say that questions such as the Kremlin internal reaction to all of this are extremely interesting. These are questions we're going to take up in the spring, Steve, in our course here at Hopkins. But let's first talk about Russian goals, and they were pretty obvious. Number one, demilitarization, meaning destroy the Ukrainian armed forces. Number two, the so-called denazification of the Ukrainian armed forces. And what you see here, very interestingly, is that for the side, especially associated with Gerasimov, the side that developed so-called hybrid warfare, is to some extent now the prisoner of its own disinformation. There is no Nazis in charge in Ukraine. The president, of course, as we all know, who's had his Churchill moment this week, is of Jewish heritage whose family perished in the Holocaust. So this is on its face ridiculous. On the issue of demilitarization, of course, that requires careful planning, careful execution. And so far, we've seen a lot of mistaken planning and a lot of bad execution. I still think that in the end, meaning week or two, the Russians will prevail, but it's been nowhere near as smooth as you might think. Those of us who have taken or read military history, we all know, as the cliche goes, that a military operation does not survive the first shot. So where are we going today? The first few days of the conflict was actually a blitzkrieg. Russia sent armored columns along 4 axes from the north down toward Kiev, from the northeast, Belgorod toward Kiev. The Donbass area was not particularly active in the first few days. And then in the south, Russian airborne, Russian regular armed forces, backed by vessels in the Black Sea, started to expand the Crimea territory toward Mariupol, toward all those towns along the Ukraine-held side of Crimea that have been contentious for so many years, since the Maidan in 2014. Well, what's happened? Well, it turns out it's slower than they figured. The tanks coming down from the north, mostly around Chernobyl toward Kiev, have been slowed by whatever. And the whatever is what people have been debating about this week. Is it a strategic pause where the Russians pause, regroup, reinforce, refuel, and then strike ahead? Well, that's one explanation. The other explanation is that the Ukrainian resistance has been incredibly fierce and unexpected. After all, if Vladimir Putin thinks it's just a piece of dirt with a colony of NATO weapons, this must have been a real shock. So what has happened then is that while the forces are closing in on Ukraine and its major cities, Kiev, Kharkiv in the northeast, and in the south along the Black Sea, progress is almost nowhere as fast as they apparently had hoped. In particular, people have been forced to look at focusing on the attack toward Kiev from the north and northeast. This morning, there were, as you probably have read, I believe 4 miles straight of tanks ready to go. But as the blitzkrieg has slowed down, Russia has then changed its tactics, going from precision, Gerasimov style, reformed, cool, mobile, quickness, and all that stuff, to a slog. Excuse me. And it's no coincidence that after the strategic pause of Sunday, they have now apparently shifted their tactics, going into more, unfortunately, bombing of civilian areas, civilian structures, strategic infrastructure in Kiev, a city I know very well. They hit the television tower today and so forth. So every day, people are measuring the progress of this combined force toward Kiev. And it was 24 kilometers away yesterday, and it's about 21 kilometers away today. Russia has now reinforced its initial Gerasimov fast-moving mechanized modern forces, and now it's a much more of a traditional slog. I heard even as late as this afternoon, it's still a problem. There's mud on the roads going into Kiev from the north and northwest. A lot of the tanks have stopped. They're afraid to go off the road into the side streets and so forth. So they're not moving as fast as they thought. This makes them, of course, a sitting duck for Ukrainian pushback. Ukraine's air force is pretty weak. These tanks could be knocked out if they had a Western-style air force of size and capability, but it hasn't happened yet. So I think personally, as we talk today, Tuesday afternoon, the violence will increase rather than decrease. The violence will increase as Putin starts to apply overwhelming force to Ukraine. Sooner or later, the reasoning I think goes, they're going to run out of ammunition, they're going to run out of morale, and so forth. And that's really where we are today. I think the negotiations 2 days ago was a joke. The man who led the Russian delegation I once debated, and he's crazy, and he's even more on another planet than Vladimir Putin. So that the composition itself suggested the Russians are not that serious at the moment. So what do they want? I think that they still want to get rid of the government. I think that they still want to take over Kyiv. And I think as they approach, they're going to have to decide to increase the violence even further or surround Kyiv and besiege it from the outside, because certainly the water, the food supplies are short inside the city. I know that from my many friends who live there, but so far, the Ukrainians have held fast. In Kharkiv, which is an interesting place because it's not only Russian speaking, it is a center of Ukrainian self-identity and culture. So Kharkiv, Russian speaking, is in fact one of the hard-boiled cities opposed to Putin. And it was opposed in 2014, it's opposed now, and they have fought fiercely over the past week to keep the Russians away. They now appear surrounded, and we'll see what happens. They have not surrendered, but it took the Russians, I believe, 4 days just to enter the city. And so Kharkiv is under danger. Kiev has that periphery around it of about 24 kilometers, protecting it so far, at least, from the Russian invaders. And then in the south, which is a weaker front, the Russians are making steadier progress, but even then have been getting distracted. So what are we looking for here? If we ask, can the Ukrainians push back? Ammunition, supplies, equipment. Not only does the West have to get supplies into the Ukrainian side, which usually go by land from Poland, Lithuania, driven to Lviv, and then eastward to the front, the Russians themselves have gas and morale problems and equipment problems. So both sides are a little more desperate, I think, than they were, and we just have to see what happens. I don't think their ultimate Russian goals have changed, decapitation and occupation of the country, but this is a huge country, as they say on CNN every 2 minutes, the size of Texas. And I think it's going to be absolutely or almost impossible, even if Russia takes over the government and starts to occupy. I think it's going to take a long, I don't think the Ukrainians will ever surrender. It's going to be a long, prolonged street battles, partisan campaigns that's likely to happen for years to come if Russia does manage to take over the country and take over the capital. I went about 340, Steve, so I apologize.
No, thank you. That's excellent insight, Dr. Jensen. So we're right at 3:40 Eastern time. So what I'm going to do is I have loads of questions, but I am not going to ask them because we want to give our audience times to ask questions. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Ard, who is going to manage our audience's questions.
All right, Steve, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for the great presentations and really very stimulating. Like Steve, I have a lot of questions too, but we're going to prioritize our audience. So let me start with George, and this might be a good one for you, Don. And I'm going to paraphrase this, George. How do we factor in the failure of the Minsk Accords as part of this problem? Was that stillborn, or did that really ever have a chance to get to a peaceful resolution?
Who wants to go first?
Why don't you take that, Don? Take it.
Okay, yeah, the Minsk Accords were essentially, and I will show my half diplomat background here. They were essentially an agreement, actually two agreements signed by Ukraine at the point of a gun in early 2015, which is to say, after that first shock of Russian invasion the previous summer, the Ukrainians pushed back, and then the Russians finally introduced regular military. Don't believe the separatist little green men myth. It's not true. These were regular Russian military, which finally pushed back Ukraine to the point of basically where the line of demarcation is now. The Minsk Agreement provided for, supposed to provide a resolution for the conflict, decentralization, a ceasefire, decentralization of power, ceasefire, withdrawal of Russian troops across the border, and a number of other things. It was never implemented. My view is primarily because it was so vaguely worded that neither side could agree on what that sequence should be. The Russians didn't want to leave without securing the Donbass. Ukraine wanted its country back and couldn't establish border control if the Russians didn't pull back. So they defer in their interpretation of the agreement. The French and Germans have always tended to support Minsk more than the US has. And what's happened now is Putin's decision last week has essentially blown up the Minsk process. I would add that if you read the original document, they are signed not only by the sides, Ukraine, Russia, France, Germany, they are signed as well by these so-called heads of the so-called Donbass, Lugansk entities, which are not legally binding in any court of law, international law. But the Russian view is always that Ukraine must negotiate directly with these things. And these things are really little more than kind of a geographic areas with some, but not overwhelming loyalty from the population, run by a bunch of brigands who are then supplied by Russia and propped up militarily. So I personally think it's about time we got rid of Minsk, but of course, having nothing at all is even worse. So we have to see where all of this goes. There's a so-called Normandy format associated with this, which is to say the parties to the document, the Minsk document, meet periodically to talk about the issues. Where Minsk has probably been most successful is the monitoring missions for the OSCE, which have, until last week, a permanent presence in the so-called line of contact to monitor ceasefire violations. And the Russian side overwhelmingly are the cause of most of the ceasefire violations. That's not me saying it, that's the reports of the OSCE. But Minsk now appears to be a dead letter. Question is now, where do we go from here? And I think it's going to be really a long slog, even if there's a ceasefire in the next few days.
Thanks very much, Don. There's another question from Laura asks, and I think, Elizabeth, you covered a little bit of this. Maybe you can say more about it. Do we have a sense of the impact that the war is having or will have on Ukraine's food production?
Yeah, I think that's extremely concerning, and you don't hear a lot about that in the news. But if, and of course, we don't know yet where it's going to go, how bad it's going to be. But if they actually are targeting grain silos, that's extremely concerning. And as I mentioned, particularly to vulnerable countries that import grain from that region. So again, it's early days. I would say that we don't know how bad it's going to get, but it is a major concern.
Yeah, thank you. From Trevor, he asks, have we seen or are we seeing sabotage on the pipeline system running from through Ukraine? Has that been a factor yet? I mean, anybody who thinks that they may have an answer on that.
I don't think we know yet, given we're in the fog of war right now. but there have been issues over the years between the two parties. Certainly, there's been a lot of there's been disputes, there's been alleged theft, and in fact, it was found by an arbitration court that the Ukrainians were siphoning gas out of these pipelines. So, and all this, and there was some rulings made in favor of Russia on that actually by arbitral commission. So it's long disputed, but at the moment we don't know exactly, I think, what the state of play really is.
Right. And what, by the way, and the flow from, Nord Stream 2, will that have any significance on this?
This is going to hurt Russia.
Yeah.
It'll hurt Europe too. It hurts everybody. But now this is just an enormous setback. Putting aside the gas flows and the impacts on the market, Nord Stream 2 had to survive political challenges in Europe and Germany, and also at the EU level in relation to the United States not wanting to see that happen. There are interests, of course, in Europe that there's the oil and gas trade with Russia has counterparties in Germany and Europe, and there has been support for these projects. But at this point, that support now is untenable. With Nord Stream 2 now indefinitely on hold, and we don't know when that's going to come back. We are now looking at the onset of sanctions. Plus, if you consider the implications of being taken off the SWIFT system by countries that are joining that, Russia's being isolated, and its number one lifeline for its economy, which is oil and gas, is being shut down. And so this is going to have, and it's right now, job one is dealing with the invasion and the and the human cost of this. But in the longer term, Russia is going to be faced with, and so is the West, incidentally, trying to deal with how to pick up the pieces of this relationship and not put Russia in a situation in which they're punished to the point that it's kind of a World War I type punishment, because that may come back to roost in 10 or 20 years as well. So this is an extraordinarily bad situation, and that's why I said maybe the best case scenario is Russia simply pivots east, but it may not be quite that simple.
Thanks. A very, very interesting point, the last one, and a historical analogy. Ron, I believe Elizabeth answered the question, at least as much as we know so far, about impact on food exports to the Middle East. Elizabeth, do you have anything more to add on that?
No, it's pretty early, so I couldn't really speak to that. But again, it's concerning, and I would, again, tell the audience if they have any interest in that to keep an eye out at the Conflict and Environment Observatory. I think they have up to the minute kind of information. But right now, it's really too early to speculate. But it's definitely concerning.
Well, one area that has been the subject of a lot of speculation, and it is very early, and Caleb asks about, regardless of the outcome, whether a Russia victory or defeat, could this be the beginning of the end for Putin politically and Russia economically? Any thoughts from the panel on that? I don't know is also a good answer.
Should be.
Yeah, right.
If I could add a little bit on the issue of the elite support, I think you have to always look at all of this as at least two separate arenas. One is the Russian elite culture, Putin, the so-called Siloviki, the oligarchs, and all of that stuff, RT. The other is the broader public opinion. And broader public opinion, I think, is very negative toward the US and Ukraine right now, of course, but broader public opinion, I think, has rallied a little bit, but this is not Crimea 2014. What you've really seen that's been very interesting is the clear signs of disagreement among the Russian elites. The West has now peeled off 3 affluent billionaires, Abramovich, Friedman, Avin, who are openly against the war. Just before the invasion, there were 3 open letters by KGB or army generals opposing the war. And I think even in the now famous National Security Council film last Monday, when Putin sat there and pontificated for a long time, you saw even the head of the KGB, Narishkin, get dressed down by Putin for not being enthusiastic enough about invading. So there's clearly unease. I think it probably won't form into a coalescence that could threaten Putin, but it certainly hurts the war effort. Just today, Moscow, I have no life, so I read Kremlin's Telegram social media channels. There was a rumored dispute between the KGB and the armed forces about how to conduct the campaign. So this is maybe not true, maybe it is true, but there's clear signs of unease. And there's, to me, no question this is not enthusiastically supported by the group around Putin. And that's really a problem.
Don has got a good point there. I think one of the real interesting parts about this, I think Don hits it right on target, is
Ron, how are you? I haven't seen you in 5 years. Good
in
to see
Finland.
you.
I know. Still alive and still well. You are too, buddy.
Good to see you.
Really haven't had a real opportunity to control inside that message as strong as he would normally would. And it's been fascinating to watch them sending sort of the nasty memos to Facebook and to Google and to other players, sort of saying, well, take this anti-Russian stuff off, or we're going to do X, Y, and Z. It's almost as though he didn't hear himself going in that there. In fact, again, we were talking before about sort of the 80s assumption that, well, everybody's going to shut up, line up, and follow this thing. And I think, people can overplay the cyber, they can overplay the soft power part, they can certainly overplay, I always call it the water, the information part. But it has been interesting to watch in this, that in fact, that kind of solidarity, you and I, Don, grew up in an era, we would never would have heard that. Wouldn't. It would have been on some sabotage that was, passed around the capital city. So it's been surprising, even letting out the film of Gerasimov and those guys sitting at the table looking at him like they were in a bad staff meeting. That wouldn't have been done previously. That would have been controlled. So it's sort of interesting to see him try to deal with the 21st century. Not always well, but again, as you pointed out, does he care? There's ultimately only one goal here, and it's to take Ukraine. If he takes a lot of guff in the meantime, then, so what?
Thanks. Another question from our viewers. Sheila asks, that we're hearing a lot about people questioning how much skin does America have in the game on this. We see the impact that this is having now on NATO countries, and how even nearby non-NATO countries are developing some strategic clarity over what's going on. How do we talk in terms of this for America and our responsibilities, or what is the strategic impact on us here?
Well,
go ahead, Don. You're the political guy.
I will reflect my Jesuit high school education and say values matter. And Ukraine is a democracy, if a flawed one, seeking to be a member of the Western community at a time when it's in some crisis. And I think that's important. And I think they're trying to do that against an implacable enemy who hates the United States, want to undermine the institutions we stand for, the values we stand for. And I think it's absolutely a cause that we should support. And I strongly believe that. I'm sorry to see a chunk of the American public not agree, but I strongly believe that. In many ways, it's some of the East European countries that take the idea of a democracy or NATO more seriously than some of the fat older ones in the western part of the continent. So I think it's very much a matter of U.S. interests.
Yeah, I must
Thanks,
admit, I've been
Don.
personally a little bit surprised that we haven't got more of a pushback from it. We were hearing about, it's the 20-year war. We're all tired of this. We're going to go away. It's enough. And I think, again, I'll talk up my end of the cyber world. I think there's something to be said about the social media and about the ability to see the combat, see what's going on with these people. And the Ukrainian president, he's certainly not Ronald Reagan, but he's done a nice job of presenting his case, in a young, forceful fashion. And I think there were some constituencies there, in fact, that have been set back a little bit. You look bad by suggesting that we shouldn't care.
Another question from Ram is, after this invasion, if Russia's successful, do we expect that other attacks will follow? And let's add, I'm going to add to somebody else's question to this. Will Belarus join in the conflict?
Well, they already have.
Right.
They're either Belarus soldiers now moving on Kiev, or Russian soldiers dressed like Belarus soldiers moving on Kiev. But in any case, the referendum over the weekend said that Belarus now is willing to re-adopt a policy of deploying nuclear weapons. I mean, that's a pretty decisive change for me. I don't know if they're good soldiers, but
another question is, and this has been raised a lot in the press, and what do we see? In fact, can we make any judgments about Putin's mental state, and what, for example, especially the announcements on the saber rattling about nuclear weapons?
Well, I'll talk about, from an intelligence standpoint, what it is like to try to do psychiatry on someone from 6,000 miles away from a different culture. It has done. Jensen and I have had some interesting conversations about this, or we did at one point in time. I always think that you misestimate when you do this. It's pop psychology under the best of circumstances. The best I've heard at this point is this is, Putin going for his last hurrah, that kind of thing. He's 69 now. He's going to make his mark before he goes. And he saw us as being weak in Afghanistan. I mean, you can put all the pieces together you want, but I think that, certainly from the USG standpoint, there, as near as I can tell, everybody seems to believe that he is a rational being, that the saber rattling over the nuclear weapons was him being very angry and frustrated. But Don, you run the same tracks I do and more. What do you think?
Yeah, Ron, I agree with you. I mean, again, aren't these aren't nuclear weapons always on alert? I mean, I thought they were, but it seemed
he
to
went
me
from DEFCON 4 to 3 is what he did, as near as I can tell. He just
is
sort of
that right?
left it a bit.
They're always dangerous, whether they're sleeping or not. I agree with you, Ron. Yeah, absolutely. But I do think it was a message to NATO to stay away. It's related indirectly, but interestingly, to this issue of weapons deliveries to Ukraine from the West. The Russians have told the Ukrainians, as I understand it, that we're gonna start bombing your supply caravans coming in from Poland and Lithuania, and we don't consider them NATO. As soon as they go into Ukrainian territory, we're going to bomb them. So Putin wants the alliance to stay away, and he's going to even saber rattle or nuke rattle to get that.
I'd like to add, I think it, we've seen this play out in past wars that the US has been involved in, where we've been an active actor, where, we indulge the idea that our opponent is crazy or evil. And I think that does a real disservice to having a meaningful debate, a public debate. I certainly not condoning anything, and I think this was an awfully stupid mistake on Putin's part. But there are reasons to think that there is a Russian viewpoint here, particularly from the energy side. And I think in the long run, Putin's looking, I think he understands that his country is very likely at risk of failure, being a failed state. I think he's accelerated that, but there's always been a concern that, his economy being so dependent on oil and gas in a world in which we're decarbonizing, poses a real threat to his country and his regime, which of course, he's a theptocrat. But having said that, that's different than being crazy. This may be desperation. Now that he's made a terrible mistake in judgment, he may become unstable. And he might rationalize in his mind that winning this, if it means a tactical nuclear weapon deployment, might be worth it. And I know in the comments there's questions and there's been debate. So where he was when he started this and where he's going to end up in the middle of it, where he's making very difficult now decisions in a situation in which he's not being entirely successful as planned, could also change too. But I think that in terms of the public debate, I would discourage just these kinds of theories that, we've all indulged in them. I'm sure I have, certainly, about him being crazy or, Napoleon complex or what have you. And I think that just does a disservice to understanding the real situation and then fashioning the solutions that are going to need to come. Because unfortunately, now that, even if this can be repelled, there's going to have to be a long-term arrangement that does not create more instability for Europe and its largest neighbor to the east.
Thanks. A couple of questions, and I think I'm going to merge a few together, which are about really the Russian people's reaction to this. One of our viewers asks, recently on TikTok, there was a trend where users will leave reviews on restaurants in Moscow, but using this as a format to disseminate information about what's, I guess, going on in Moscow. And do you see this as a strong tactic to combat Russian misinformation? And likewise, I mean, how much are we seeing in terms of Russian public protest on the war?
It's really been a mixed bag. I mean, I've been following, Don was talking about being overwhelmed by stuff coming in. I mean, information is a fire hose right now, but I'll just take the TikTok game, and you have to, to my mind, this is an interesting little bell and whistle that's ringing out there. If it's not going to stop the invasion of Ukraine, but I am interested to see how much the Ukrainians have taken advantage of it to present their viewpoint. It has been interesting to see the Russians pushing back and trying to little things like what a nuclear weapon would do if it blew off over Washington or New York, or a young person opening up a letter from Uncle Sam saying you've been drafted. Things like the restaurant reviews to get some of the information out. And, the Russians know it and they're trying to push back right now. I have no doubt in my mind that very shortly Facebook and TikTok and others will either be shut down or content will be removed by the government online. I mean, they control the illusion of cyberspace is that there are no borders or boundaries up until someone finds the fiber optic cable where you can take an axe and cut it. So they'll let it go for now, but they've already sent messages, in fact, quite clearly that they want to see some of this content cut back. So, again, and also their internal internet as well is being severely monitored right now. So interesting sort of byplay, side play, but I would take it for what it is right now, which is it's a little bit of just people being able to vent and vent online.
By the way, the Ukrainian embassy here told me this morning they no longer have email, and so they talk to me now in texting. But a friend of mine in Moscow, who's pretty well placed, sent me an article from Kommersant. It didn't get here because they've shut down Kommersant, or maybe a Ukrainian hacker runs shut down Kommersant. We just don't.
Well, they're
know.
hacking each other all over the place.
Yeah,
you get pronouncements. Anonymous, whoever they may not be, have put on very grim announcement with their Guy Fawkes face and voice about the attack. It has been interesting, of course, in looking at the vigilante aspect of it, the mercenary aspect of people stepping in to this dimension of cyberspace, which is a dimension of soft power and all the rest of it. So everybody wants to be a player, and Ukraine has encouraged that to a large extent. They don't have a lot going in that direction. They do now, and I noticed the EU is sending, or NATO is sending some of the guys down from Tallinn, in fact, where you and I were at one point, to come down and help. But the Russians are very well developed, and the GRU, the SVR, the FSB, each one of them have very large cyber units of one form or another. What really has surprised me so far has been that it has really been on the soft side and the water side, and it has not been a direct hit on the hardware or the software. And I keep waiting for it, and I keep thinking we're going to go on here for a little bit, and then the next thing you know, lights shut down, pipe boilers shut down, or whatever else. We have not seen that yet, but I think it's out there.
Thanks. Oil question. Price of oil hovering around 100. I don't dollars a barrel. I didn't check it this morning, Craig. Sorry. But what do you see is the situation with the price of oil as this conflict continues, and how are we going to reach a point of equilibrium? We'll be able to adjust.
Go up in the near term. It's difficult, if not impossible, to give estimates, anything that's precise, but directionally we know eventually that'll be alleviated, and it also in the more medium term, to long term, it's going to depend a great deal on what the outcome is in terms of resolution. It will take a couple of years certainly for new LNG to be, facilities to be built in Europe and so on. We're going to have a resolution to this conflict well before then, but the point being is you can't really predict these things. It's going to be volatile. How's that?
Thanks.
That much we know.
Oh, thanks. Just like after any war with oil states involved, it always has a huge impact on the market. Working hard to get through everybody's questions, everyone. Fantastic response from the audience. Peter, give me a heads up if we have to get near closing time, but I'm trying to get through as many as we can. Do we have a sense of NATO's intelligence assets on the ground in Ukraine? Do we have any sense of this so far?
You've seen, I think, to some extent what's there right now. I mean, there have been programs being developed there over the years. There was a nice article in Yahoo a couple of weeks ago on the subject of a covert action program that's been going on there since 2015 from the CIA in terms of supporting and whatever else. That also means gathering information. This is one of those moments, and anybody who's been in the business knows that when things move really fast, info just stinks. So you don't have a good feel for what's going on the ground. If you're following open source intelligence at this point, which is in fact, the conglomeration of all of those sources out there from Twitter and from Facebook and from whatever else, and dealing with Google overhead, by the way, a lot of people playing on that one, a lot of the commercial intelligence companies playing in that direction. You can get a little bit of an idea of force placement on the ground. You get a little bit of idea of who's doing what to whom where, but it's pretty fast moving, thin gruel, and that's not a surprise given the circumstance.
I'm just going to add to that question. Are we getting any sense of the losses that the Ukrainian military has taken in the last week?
Yes, but I don't have a good number. Okay. I follow the Russian stuff much more closely because the Ukrainians have been pretty tight on all of this. But the Russian number is about 5,000 plus or minus, from what I hear. And the Ukrainians lost 60 this morning in an explosion yesterday. So I would say the Ukrainian losses are lower. It's easier to play defense in some ways.
What about in terms of heavy weapons?
My technical problems prevented me from reading you off the latest. But I get the Ukrainian count 3 times a day, and it's been pretty impressive, actually.
Very good.
And I'll look for it now as you guys are talking.
All right, yeah, jump in if you have an answer on that. I was also expecting not just Russian losses, but Ukrainian, if we know, in terms of what capability they may have to punch back. Question about many of our viewers have been asking questions regarding nuclear escalation here, and it's a very difficult thing, I think, to answer. But in light of what, I mean, I think we've been trying to do to avoid greater provocation, what do you see maybe as a red line for the Russians on this?
Well, if NATO gets involved, I think that would be a red line. And that would be
Involved,
me, boots on the ground.
boots on the, what about providing air cover?
I think that would be close to it.
Yeah.
There's been a big debate about no-fly zone, as you know, the last week, and
Right.
but I think the tactical use would probably be that Russian response. But that's just me.
Right. Okay, going through some more questions here. Thank you.
Could I
Please go ahead.
one of you, I just buzzed through the chat, and one of you raised the question of using intel in the campaign by both sides, and that's Ron knows probably better than I do. That's used all the time. But what you and I've worked on so-called hybrid warfare for a lot of years, and for the first time, you see a relatively coherent U.S. pushback in the run-up to the war, as the Biden administration was declassifying stuff about the date of the invasion and all of that. And I thought that was pretty effective, keeping the Russians on the back foot. It didn't prevent an invasion, but it was heartening to see an attempt to play a little information operation back to them, because they're so they're always praised for being so good at it, and it doesn't always work. And
you're right, Don. I mean, there's we sort of up front when you were hooking on here, so I'm stealing anything, but it's no. You know, I think every once in a while it happens. It helps to have the right people in the right place. You know, you've got someone in Bill Burns who knows what, you know, intel can be used for. Biden was on the intel committee and the oversight stuff for years. He knows it well. Jake Sullivan knows how to use it well. And so the idea, you know, in sort of in cyber world, what I found out is the UV light that kills the germs is basically the truth. You know, if you can get it out there and explain, and you're right. I mean, you keep them on the back foot. You just give them, this is what's going to happen. This is what you're going to do. I don't think it's going to prevent anything, but it certainly makes, you know, uncomfortable someone who is looking to be as stealthy as possible, living back in the old Russian world of the 80s. And I think they got called out, and I don't know whether it maintains its effectiveness going forward, with the exception of, you know, sort of saying, well, look, guys, it's, you know, these are lies, and, you know, this kind of disinformation, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, going up into this thing, I think they did a pretty good job.
Folks, the Ukrainians, 9 o'clock this morning, claimed 5,700 dead Russians, 200 prisoners, 29 aircraft, 29 helicopters, 198 tanks, 846 APVs, 77 artillery. You get the list. So that's pretty impressive. If it's true, and maybe it's not true, I don't know, but that's what they claimed this morning.
Thanks. A question on one of our viewers asked about, you know, long-term environmental impact. And Elizabeth, you know, from your work, when you looked at post-conflict scenarios, I mean, in terms of sort of rebuilding a country, I know this is getting way ahead, but eventually they'll get to the point where whatever happens, Ukraine is going to have a fairly significant environmental issues to tackle. What could be, you know, what could we be looking at in terms of the cost and the length of time it would take to clean up after a conflict, even what we're seeing so far?
Wow, I mean, that's an enormously difficult question. Just looking at the potential spillage of oil, I think you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, and lengthy cleanup. Then what concerns me even more so perhaps than the oil spillage is, if you look at Bosnia, there was significant industrial spillage in Bosnia. And that just has long-term, not only impacts on the environment, but on human, human populations in the areas. And from what I've seen, it looks like many of these facilities are very close to population centers. And I find that really concerning. So we're talking about, you know, I don't even know if the industrial sites in Bosnia are really appropriately and completely cleaned up even now. And that was years and years ago. So decades ago. So I could see decades of cleanup and multi-million-dollar projects that will need to be implemented. But to start, I mean, just trying to limit the human casualties from industrial acts, spills is one of my biggest concerns in this.
Thanks. Craig, what do you see? We've been reading about this for a while now, sort of the LNG armada crossing the Atlantic from the United States, helping to make up for in supplies for Europe. How much of a surge capacity do you see the United States having in terms of LNG now? Can we do more than what we're doing?
Yes, that can be increased, and some of the production is depending upon conditions and time of year. There's going to be, though, price spikes, and there's going to be at least temporary shortages during, winter peaks. So, I think given the timing of this attack and the fact that we're now starting to come out of winter, that may give time to resolve this without as much hardship as there would have been in Europe. And of course, the impacts are going to be global because it's a global market in terms of pricing.
Thanks. And I'm going to end this with the last question, and I'm taking this from a number of folks who had asked this in a similar way. But what do we see, or can we make any predictions at this point? And what is the off-ramp here? And what might we see that? Does anybody feel they have are positioned to even make some speculation on that?
I'll start with saying that I thought we passed the off ramp I expected a way back. I thought that what he would do is liberate the two separatist republics and call it a day. Now that he's passed that, it's troubling to think where the off ramps might be. I do think part of his objective is to establish, Ukraine as a NATO free zone, and that would suggest maybe a DMZ type arrangement. But now it seems like that too is less and less likely in terms of what he's doing on the ground.
Anybody else have anything to add on that? Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for their great presentations today. And I thank our audience for their attentiveness, their great questions. We did our best to answer as we could. I think that you may have known I didn't ask any Taiwan questions. We'll save that for another day. We hope that we'll be able to get back with you soon to follow up on the conflict in Ukraine. And we thank you very much for your time today and hope to see you soon.